the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage and Multiculturalism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too share and echo your sentiments vis-a-vis the people of Ottawa-Gatineau, as well as the first responders and all those who are involved in assisting the families who are deeply affected by the events of last Friday. Mr. Speaker, I'm honoured to contribute to this debate and pleased to acknowledge that I do so on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Je remercie la députée de...
I would like to thank the member from Destiny, Mississippi, Churchill River to have introduced this bill. And I would like to also thank her for her tireless work on reconciliation.
To establish a national holiday that will allow Canadians to reflect and understand the long and painful history relating to Indigenous peoples. The road to reconciliation between Canada and Indigenous peoples requires all Canadians to understand our shared history and acknowledge past wrongs while creating a path forward. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action provide all Canadians with this renewed path forward for Canada's journey of healing and reconciliation. This bill is inspired by Call to Action number 80, which states, and I quote, "We call upon the federal government in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples to establish as a statutory holiday a national day for truth and reconciliation to honor survivors, their families and communities, and ensure that public commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools remains a vital component of the reconciliation process." That is why, when the calls to action were released in June of 2015, the Prime Minister, who was then the leader of the Liberal Party opposition, immediately affirmed the unwavering support of the Liberal Party of Canada and our parliamentary caucus for all the TRC's recommendations and called on the Government of Canada to take immediate action to implement them. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report on December of 2015, the Prime Minister then committed the Government of Canada to working, and I quote, "in partnership with Indigenous communities, the provinces, territories, and other vital partners to fully implement the calls to actions of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, starting with the implementation of the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples." This past June, our government supported and passed Bill 262, an act to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also known as UNDRIP. This February, our government established a recognition of rights framework, a fundamental shift in approach between Canada and Indigenous peoples. Today, there are over 60 rights recognition tables around the country that seeks to advance the process of this recognition and ultimately self-determination. Our Prime Minister noted earlier this year that reconciliation calls upon all of us to confront our past and commit to charting a brighter, more inclusive future. We must acknowledge that centuries of colonial practices have denied the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. The recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights will chart a new way forward for our government to work with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples to undo decades of mistrust, poverty, broken promises, and injustices. We have listened and learned, and we will work together to take concrete action to build a better future and a new relationship. Over the past 3 budgets, the government has invested significantly to advance the implementation of the calls to action and to support the crucial work with our Indigenous partners to identify and address joint priorities. In fact, progress has already been made on over 80% of the calls to action under federal or shared responsibility. But we know that more must be done and that we need to be held accountable for advancing this crucial work. Le Conseil de l'Administration Provinciale de Conseil National.
The Administration Council of the provincial body has presented its report on Crown Indigenous relations on June 2nd of this year. The final report indicated that it is important for Indigenous peoples, Canadians, and for the government to establish a National Council for Reconciliation. It would be a long-term body and which would receive enough funding and which would be enshrined in law. This council will periodically represent a report to ensure continued monitoring of the implementation of the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It will also ensure that there is accountability.
For Reconciliation's mandate will be to advance reconciliation efforts through the development and implementation of a multi-year national action plan for reconciliation. The conclusion of the final report makes the following poignant observation. We believe that hope is the first step in reconciliation. We believe hope is the basic building block upon which reconciliation must lay its foundation. We must plant and nurture seeds of hope in Indigenous communities and in the greater Canadian public. Hope gives us the belief that all actions matter, no matter how small and no matter by whom. With trust, Canadians and Indigenous peoples can work together on building a new future, a better future. It all begins with hope. We also need all Canadians to know that progress is being made. The work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has opened the eyes of many Canadians to the horrific truths of residential schools. The Indian residential schools was a systematic plan to remove Indigenous children from their homes, families, and cultures to facilitate the policy of killing the Indian in the child. During my tenure in the Indigenous Affairs Committee, we heard from so many survivors of the residential school system. The member for Abitibi Bay James Nunavik EU has shared his experience with all of us and has educated us in this House of his time in residential schools. Survivors like him continue to educate all Canadians of our past, but equally inspire us to do better. All Canadians have a responsibility to educate themselves about this dark chapter of our shared history and work toward repairing the intergenerational damage caused by this appalling policy. This is why our government is unequivocally committed to the implementation of the TRC calls to action and will be supporting sending this legislation to committee for further study. Reconciliation is not an Aboriginal problem. It is a Canadian one. These are the words of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report and words that member from Deschanette, Mississippi, Churchill River quoted in her speech when she introduced the bill that we're debating today. I wholeheartedly agree with this sentiment. I also believe that healing the damage of residential schools will not only require the sustained action of involved governments, but other institutions and of all Canadians. The need to achieve reconciliation is a fundamental truth and is beyond partisan politics. That is why I'm so pleased at the recent motion by the member for Timmins James Bay calling on the Pope to implement Call to Action 58 and issue an apology on behalf of the Catholic Church to residential school survivors, their families and communities, passed with the overwhelming support of this House. We look forward to working across party lines to ensure that this legislation fulfills calls to action number 80 and reflects the collaboration with Aboriginal peoples contained in its text. Together, we will chart a path forward that advances reconciliation and builds a stronger future for Indigenous peoples and Canadians alike. Thank you, Madam Speaker.